Hey, how's it going? I hope you're doing all right. So tonight, what the lecture is going to focus on is on group bias. The previous lecture was focused on individual bias, and we've been kind of trying to set out a lot of basic concepts in critical thinking in this series of videos. I want to basically make a reminder of one of the themes that we talked about in one of the previous videos, which is the insight of Socrates. Socrates, of course, is the very famous ancient Greek philosopher, and in one of the most famous writings by Plato, the Apology, he's recounting his his life. And one of the things that he was told in his life was by the oracle, at least this was secondhand even to him, that said that Socrates was the wisest man basically in the Greco Roman world, and he just couldn't wrap his mind around it. How could he be the wisest person? And so he went around and he talked with experts about various things, experts of education, experts of war, experts of, art, whatever it was. He talked with experts to try to figure out their craft and really to see if there were other people that were smarter or wiser than him. But what he found whenever he talked with experts, supposedly, was that they really couldn't explain what it was that they were doing. And so, faced with basically this contradictory information that on the one hand he was supposed to be the wisest man in that arena, but on the other hand, he didn't himself feel as though he had any specialized knowledge. He came to the conclusion that he knew that he didn't know. Socrates said, "I know that I don't know." Kind of paradoxical. How can you know something in a sort of negative way? You know that you don't know. But we talked about the social effects of that, how in communities it's way more caustic, it's way more damaging to have people who are purported experts who think that they know things when actually they don't. And inversely, someone like Socrates, at least portrayed in the most sympathetic way, someone who says, you know what, I'm not sure if I do know. I'm gonna go ask some people, I'm gonna investigate some stuff, and then I'll get back to you. That kind of person is usually much better for something like a community. And so what the group biases tonight are going to talk about are kind of these very famous concepts, famous studies that you've probably run into already. I mean, I assigned this class or I assigned this book to my logic and critical thinking classes. David McRaney's "You Are Not So Smart." There's a couple of relevant chapters in this, and I'm going to try, because I assigned the McRaney text, not to go too much into what McRaney says, but I'm going to hit some of the fundamentals. But because I think it's really important to talk about these ideas. All right. So the two things that we're going to talk about tonight are the tragedy of the commons and the Dunning-Kruger effect. So let's kind of get into it. But just setting up the context, because again, I really like Greek philosophy. I wanted to give some quotes from Aristotle. So writing almost 2,500 years ago. So Aristotle was the student of Plato, who's the student of Socrates. So these three are kind of the bigs as far as philosophy, especially in the European tradition. And even back then, I think Aristotle was understanding that there are these problems, and I think these are the problems that the two things that we're going to talk about tonight kind of are centered on. And the first quote is both quotes are from Politics, but in the first quote, Aristotle says this: "Humans are naturally political animals. Those who lack capacity to cooperate or are so self-sufficient that they don't need to must be either beasts or gods." So I've taken liberty with the Greek a little bit in kind of like my own tweaked translation here. You'll hear this phrased in various ways. But nonetheless, whenever Aristotle is looking at humanity, one of the things that he looks, or one of the things that he says is we just are the kind of species that live together. That's just part of what it is. We aren't maybe bacteria. We aren't maybe fungi, although, some of these things live with like really intense mycelial networks and stuff like that. We aren't individualistic species. We are a species who live in collectives. We are a species who live in communities. When he says political, he's referring to living in cities, living, in groups of families or whatever else. That's what we do. That's part of what it is. And it's so strange to think about someone who wouldn't live in a collective or who wouldn't live in a city that Aristotle basically dismisses such people who are able to provide for all of their needs and do everything that they need all on their own, just as a sole individual person. He says that that person would either be a beast, an animal, right, or a god. Something about humans means that we depend on other people. And so that's kind of like the first bit of orange text there. We have to live together. We have to live with one another. We really depend on one another, especially the more needs that we have. I mean, none of us generated ourselves. We had parents who generated us. None of us raised ourselves, especially not in our very early years. There's just something about humanity that makes us social species, that makes us live in communities, that makes us rely on one another. That's part of what it means to be human. Now, one of the other things that comes out of this, though, and this isn't very much further in the politics, whenever he has this observation too, he says, quote, "Things with the most owners receive the least care. People care for their private possessions most, for common things least." So Aristotle, he's kind of like infamous for this sort of thing. Very famous philosopher of ancient Greek stuff is named Martha Nussbaum, and she has this really amazing phrase called "the fragility of goodness." It's the title of one of her books. And so for Aristotle, part of what it means to be human is to depend on other people. But part of depending on other people also makes us really vulnerable to other people and to other communities. That's just the human condition. Where on the one hand we do need others to survive, but on the other hand, others can they can be really big sources of love and meaning and wonderful things, but they can also be really big sources of disappointment, of betrayal, of all of the negative stuff. And I think Aristotle is pointing to another source of vulnerability here, which is, again, living in common. We often have these things, collective stuff. You can think of something like an infrastructure that we all own and use, but because we all own and use it, it seems as though we don't really care about it as much as our individual things. So if you have nice clothes, or if you have a nice car, or if you have just something that you really like, you care way more about that than you do care about the roads, or that you care about having an unpolluted source of water, or that you care about making sure that people in your city have good schooling systems or whatever else. Now, you might care for those things, and if you're a person with a conscience, you will care for those things. And if you're a person who's politically conscientious, you will vote, especially in local elections or things like the school board or whatever else, for people who will improve those things. Nonetheless, I think there's a little bit of what we might call in a loose philosophical way, phenomenology, where when you pay attention to your own experience, as angry as I might be about driving through crappy roads whenever I have to, it doesn't hit the same as thinking about losing one of my favorite things, whether it's like books or whatever else. So there seems to be this really weird set of problems that comes out of being a social species. Other people can make us really happy. Other people can make us really miserable, but we have to work together. And when we work together, especially with complex things like infrastructure or whatever else, we have to face an added psychological hurdle that we tend not to care about the common things as much as we care about private things, okay? So I'm going to open up with a tragedy of the commons because it's a really famous sort of thought experiment or proposal or observation. It turns into empirical studies as well. But the tragedy of commons is basically this, and I'm going to give you one particular thing, but there's a lot of different versions of it. So imagine that we live in a city, okay? And there is this pasture, and that's kind of shown here by the little fenced in thing, that no one really owns, right? It's not any individual person's land, but and we know that we can use it for our own cattle or for our own herding animals. And so this is okay. So maybe just me and my 3 or 4 friends know about this, or 3 or 4 people who have grazing animals in my community know about this. Now, it's in our interest to use this land because it's basically free land with grass that can help the animals to grow. And it might even benefit our communities in certain ways, especially if we're using the animals for whatever else, whether it's, maintaining pasture land, whether it's pulling plows, whatever you would use herd animals for. Okay, but it's also kind of a huge temptation. Maybe we see one of our friends, instead of having a couple of cattle, which is kind of what we agreed to in the first place, so that we don't overgraze the land, he starts to bring in 5 or 6. Brings in a small herd, and you notice that in the marketplace he has a little bit extra money, a little bit extra beef, and he's making considerable amount of more money than you are. And so it seems as though he's using this free resource to make more money off of the common thing than you are. So now maybe you're motivated to start to use the common land, and so is your friend. And before you know it, basically what happens is this common resource that was going to allow you to just get a little bit of good stuff, and it was benefiting the community. If it gets overgrazed, everything turns really bad. You're way overusing the common resource. And now, even though the initial motivation was me as an individual to make more money because I realized that there was more resource there, collectively, what it's led to is a really big problem, because what we've done is we've wrecked this piece of land. And now, not only myself as an individual, because I've wrecked it, I'm not profiting anymore, but us as a community are wrecked by that sort of decision. Whenever we were living in balance, whenever there weren't people exploiting the common good, stuff was okay. But basically, without regulation, it leads to tragedy, and this is called the tragedy of the commons. And the one of the classic resources is a scholar by the name of Garrett Hardin, and he says this: "Therein is the tragedy. Each man is locked into a system that compels him to increase his herd without limit, in a world that is limited. Ruin is the destination toward which all men rush, each pursuing his own best interest in a society that believes in the freedom of the commons. Freedom in a commons brings ruin to all." And the moral of this is very often that we need some sort of regulation. So the idea here, and there's a lot of economic puzzles surrounding this, is the tragedy of the commons, but you can also think of free rider problems here. Free riders are basically people who are in collectives that don't contribute to something, and they just kind of like live off of the benefits of society without giving anything back. But the tragedy of the commons is basically this: in any sort of economic system where the main motivation is for you to acquire as much as possible for yourself, whenever you're thinking individualistically and depending on constantly increasing what you do, whether it's productivity or whatever else, that is something that's going to lead to tragedy, because that is not how the world works. Even though the economic system might ask for infinite growth, the natural world is not like that. The natural world is not infinite. There are finite things. And that combination of an infinite drive to increase things in a finite world leads to a lot of really big problems. So, for example, this is why the United States legal system has things like the EPA, ideally, to regulate things like waters, to regulate things like air pollution, to regulate things like when people are drilling or transporting oil, maybe they shouldn't do it through certain areas. There's a lot of protests happening out in the Southwest with people transporting nuclear materials through Native American lands. There are tons of pipelines, right, that go through Native American lands. One of the reasons that they're upset is because they know that people will ruin the common good, or even something that's very sacred to Native people, their land, all in the name of profit. And just this idea that we constantly have to do more and more and make more and more, but we're in a very finite space. It's way better for us collectively to take care of that collective space and do less individually than it is to just wreck it. And that's what the tragedy of the commons is about. The tragedy of the commons, it's a tragedy because it's bad, is basically pointing out a very big ill that's present in our current economic system, that if we aren't critical about how we approach things, we will very much be taken in by the idea that we have to constantly increase productivity, do stuff, get new stuff, etc. That's what kind of keeps the economic system working as well as it does. But if we do that, we wreck the environment and we wreck so many things, and that's a huge tragedy. We especially wreck the stuff that we hold in common, such as our land, our air, our water, etc. It's much better for us if we think collectively and we think about preserving these things and curtailing those desires. That's what's better for the system. But in the economic system that teaches us in certain ways, that makes us aspire toward possessing certain things and making money and all that sort of stuff, that's not what we end up doing. So that's the tragedy of commons. The tragedy of the commons, generally speaking, is that we don't care for our common possessions. And if we are given access to something common without regulation, we tend to exploit that thing and just completely ruin it. We do not self-regulate very well, especially not in collectives, especially not when we see other people profiting more than we do. There's just something psychologically that's very difficult for humans to hold back when it comes to these common resources. Now, that's why you need regulation, because regulation typically says, we know that humans are going to mess this up, so let's come up with sensible laws, sensible means of regulations to make sure that collectively we have things in control. But without those regulations, basically the worst parts of our nature kind of take over. So that's the tragedy of the commons. Now, a lot of this is related to what gets called sometimes in the literature Homo economicus. So instead of Homo sapiens, right, us are the animal that is able to think. This is about the animal that does economic transactions. And I'll plug another book. This is one of my former professors. He is at the University of Houston, where I did my master's degree. But I think this is a really wonderful book. It's called Very Bad Wizard, Morality Behind the Curtain by Tamler Summers. And it's a collection of interviews. That's why I think it's a great book. I think philosophers very often are difficult to understand whenever you're reading them writing for each other. But if you get them in conversation, philosophers can say really interesting things. So it's a cool conversation. The other person who I would plug with respect to collecting interviews is a woman by the name of Maisha Cherry. She's another professor. She has a book, I think, called Unmuted, similar with a podcast. Very Bad Wizards has a podcast as well. But I recommend Tamler's book because he in particular has some interviews with people who deal with this kind of stuff. So Homo economicus basically assumes that we're rational animals, and that what we're going to do is we're always going to try to do things in our best interest. This leads to a lot of research in economics, in particular game theory, where you come up with different scenarios where you have hypothetical sort of things going on. One very famous one, and I'll just very quickly kind of talk about it, is called the prisoner's dilemma. And the prisoner's dilemma, and that's what this graphic is here, basically is this. There's two people, and in the graphic, it's represented by the red person at the top and the blue person along the side. It is, let's say, you and an accomplice, and you both commit some sort of crime. But you both get arrested. Now, the authorities suspect that you cooperated. After all, they picked you up both at the same, but they don't have enough evidence to convict either of you. But they need to get information from you, and they don't want you to collude on that information, to cooperate, to find a story, whatever else it is. So they put you in separate interrogation chambers. Okay, so you don't know what's going on. But basically, whenever they talk to you, it's very clear that the options for punishment are this. Your options are twofold. You only have two options here. You either stay silent or you testify against your friend. Okay? And the penalties are set up that in such a way that basically collectively, the total number of years served in the prison sentence collectively are the least if you both stay silent. If you both stay silent, both of you will only serve 1 year, so collectively that's 2. But you also realize that if you testify, if you testify and your friend stays silent, and that's what you had told, just don't talk to the cops. That's kind of the understanding, right? But if you testify and your friend stays silent, you get 0 years and your friend gets 3 years. So it's something where self-interest wise, I get 0 years, but as a collective, there's 3 total years served there. And you know that your friend knows that that's also the case for them. So if they rat you out and you stay silent, you know that they're going to go scot-free and that you're going to serve 3 years in prison. Okay? The least optimal outcome, however, is if you both talk. Because if you both talk, basically what that means is you both serve 2 years, collectively 4 years. And so what the prisoner's dilemma is set up to do, it's a really tricky problem, but it's a problem to think about self-interest and what you should do in this particular case. Because in a certain way, self-interest wise, the best scenarios for you to rat your friend out and for them to say nothing, because then you get out scot-free and they spend a lot of years. But if you're thinking collectively, that's going to lead to a very different problem where you're both going to stay silent. And so economists really like this because this is quantifiable. It's pretty easy to present to different people, and it's a classic problem. I'm not going to talk more about it, but I'm giving it to you here in case you hear about prisoners' dilemmas. This is what they're talking about. This is what they're talking about when they're talking about prisoners' dilemmas. Now, another really famous economic puzzle is what's called the ultimatum game. And that's why I bring up Tamler's book, because he has, in particular, one interview with Joseph Henrich. I think it's with Joseph Henrich in this particular book. And so the ultimatum game is basically this, okay? The ultimatum game, and let's say that the person in the middle has $10. Okay, let's just make the math very easy. And the person in the middle is going to give the $10 to the person on the left, and they're going to tell that person on the left, listen, you can give as much or as little money to the person on the right, but the person on the right has two options after you give them whatever amount of money you decide. That person can accept or reject that particular offer. If they accept that offer, then they get whatever was agreed to. If they reject it, no one gets anything. Okay? So if the person, for example, were to say, well, I have the $10, the person gave me the $10, I'm going to offer to that person $2, and I'm going to keep 8 myself. So I'm going to offer 2, keep 8. That person can either accept to get the $2, and then the other person gets the 8, right? Or they can reject because they think that the offer of $2 was unfair for whatever reason, and no one gets anything. The money goes back to the person in the middle. So what's interesting about this is this kind of like, it's really tough to figure out what's in your self-interest here in certain ways. And again, what's interesting about this is it's quantifiable. And you can run it over multiple rounds. You can even do it with various computer strategies. This led to, I don't know if you remember whenever we were talking about the principle of charity, Rappaport's rules. Rappaport was a programmer who made games for not the prisoner's dilemma, the ultimatum game. And what you find is that whenever you play multiple rounds of this, so you have persons who are the initial person who's making the offers, and you have persons who are accepting or rejecting, and you do this multiple times, you get lots of different data here. The reason why the interview with Joseph Henrich in Very Bad Wizard is so interesting is because they even find cultural variation. So in the United States, and I think in most of Western Europe and Canada, Australia, basically what you find is that for the most part, offers tend toward 50-50, maybe 60-40. So for example, I might offer the other person $4 and keep $6 for myself. Most of the time, that person is going to accept it, meaning they get the $4, I get $6. That's pretty good. But if you deviate too much from that, it starts to feel really weird and the offers get rejected. So in the United States, let's say that I keep $8 for myself and I only give $2. The other person is going to feel offended and reject. Now the question is, why? Why would you do that? Because $2 is still more than I had beforehand, why wouldn't I just accept that? Well, that mentality of just accepting more than you had is what they found whenever they investigated or they did these problems with tribes people, especially in South America. Because the thing is, economists thought that they were talking about rationality for humanity generally. So if we think that there's a pattern toward equality, 50-50, 60-40, we should be able to find that on every single continent with every single group of people. There might be outliers here or there, but there shouldn't be major groups of people. But what they found whenever they were doing this stuff with tribes people, first of all, they didn't have cash. So they did this with like pounds of rice or crops or something like that. And what they found with the tribes people is that they almost always would just accept whatever offer because it was like, yeah, this is awesome. I have free rice, or yeah, this is awesome. I have like yams or whatever else it is. Why would I reject that? So it was not at all like the United States. Similarly, I think this was in gift giving cultures. So I think Japan was one of these countries where in the United States, if for whatever reason, let's say that you're insecure and you really need at least a little bit of cash, you are given the $10, you decide to offer seven to the other person and only keep three because you know you need three. And you want to make sure that it doesn't get rejected. So like you're going to be very safe and offer them more and you're going to keep very little. In the United States, people will be like, that's a little bit weird, but like, I'm cool with that. I get seven, they get three, we're cool. I'm going to accept that particular offer. But in certain other countries, the idea was, I am going to reject that overly generous offer because what it feels like to me is that this might lead to future obligations to that particular person. And so, again, economists just try and use these games to figure out how we actually think about stuff. So I know that that's a lot to hold in your head. I just give them the prisoner's dilemma and the ultimatum game to you as a way of things that I think educated people should know about. And you can look these up, and there's lots of cool stuff about it. But the idea is basically with Homo economicus, the economic person, we kind of assume, or economists assume, that humans operate on a principle of self-interest. They do what's best for themselves. This is a thesis called psychological egoism. It's a descriptive thesis about the way the world is, not about how the world should be, but how people actually make decisions. Psychological egoism says that we're always operating in our best interest. One of the ways that you investigate that is by running these economic experiments, prisoners' dilemmas, ultimatum games, etc., to try and figure out whether people actually do that. But what you find is that very often we seem to be working against our self-interest. So we don't accept money whenever we're offered money, or we will punish people in certain situations, even if it's for the worse. Or again, the most important lesson so far is the tragedy of the commons. It is in our collective self-interest to keep that common resource working well and not to overuse it. And yet, without regulation, very often our psychological dispositions will lead us to exploit that common resource, especially if we see some other person doing it, so we start to try and get away with it as well. And there's a lot of empirical support for these kinds of things. It's complicated, but generally speaking, that's kind of how it is. And so this is one of the puzzles of economic research and psychological research with respect to cooperating in collectives, because it seems as though we should be working for our self-interest, but there's a lot of cases where we don't. So the puzzle becomes, in which cases are we working against our self-interest? And why are we doing that? And there's a lot of answers. I'm not going to get into it too much because this is not a psychology class. It's not an economics class. It's not an anthropology class. All great disciplines that you should totally take classes in if you have the chance. But there's a lot of answers. Well, one answer is just like, we're too dumb. Complex problems are way too complicated. Our primate brains can't understand the complexities of systemic problems, so we just mess stuff up. The way that you get around that is by having expertise. This is kind of why the president, it's really important that the president has a really good cabinet, because the president can't know everything about everything, but they can appoint experts that do know a particular area well, and that's what can help people to solve problems. So if we're too dumb, we can kind of like figure out how to deal with that. Now, the other two are a little bit different. One answer is maybe we're just spiteful. Maybe we're just okay with hurting ourselves if it means that we hurt other people as well. Certainly, that can be the motivation. Maybe I'm okay with the hailstorm knocking the windshield out of my car because it also knocked the windshield out of my neighbor's Camaro. And I really hate my neighbor and I really hate that car, right? It's an ugly side of humanity, but sometimes that's like part of the way that we think. Now, the better side, and I'll end on this note, is altruism. Sometimes it seems as though we do just like generally care for other people. So I think like if you look at nurses, if you look at social workers, if you look at teachers, especially K through 12, you're not getting paid that much money. The work is pretty tough, but you do it because you kind of feel called to do it. In religious stuff, you might call this a vocation. You literally hear a call and you answer that particular call to do that thing. Now, in any of those fields, because they pay little money, there's not very much job security, it's really tough, you're often taking a lot of damage to yourself or you're not doing as well as you could, all for the benefit of other people. So it does seem like there are all these altruistic answers. So I realize that this is hand wavy, meaning I'm not really giving answers here. I'm just kind of like gesturing towards stuff. But this is kind of like one of the things. Whenever we're the reason why I'm bringing this up is whenever we're thinking of collective problems, thinking back to that Socratic thing, realizing your limits, you kind of have to like ask questions of, is this problem really complex and maybe something that I should consult experts for? And you also have to ask questions genuinely, and this is a little painful because you have to admit how crappy your motivation sometimes can be. Is am I doing the most rational thing here? Do I just have spite? Do I just have some sort of resentment? Do I feel better than other people? Uh, is this a case where I'm being altruistic? So understanding the complexity of the problem, understanding your own motivations is something that can help you in a lot of these cases because very often I think we would like to assume that we're rational, that we're doing things in our self-interest, that we're doing what we should be doing. But if the economic research shows anything, it's that we pretty routinely act against that self-interest or do things that are kind of weird or things that can benefit us for a short period of time as individuals, but collectively really damage us and set us up for a very, very bad future. And that's what's happening in a lot of environmental stuff. For example, this is why capitalism is just this really strange economic system in a lot of ways because it depends on infinite economic growth, but the natural world is not infinite, right? So it leads to all of these problems, and this is something that economists and historians kind of talk about and debate about, or whatever else. Even if you're pro-capitalism, one of the things that you try to think about with respect to regulations is how can we regulate the economic system to make sure that this is sustainable into the future, right? That's what these problems are about. Okay, let's move forward to one of the most famous papers in psychology, and this is right here. This is the Justin Kruger, who's in the glasses, and David Dunning. This is the paper, unskilled and unaware of it, how difficulties in recognizing one's own incompetence lead to inflated self-assessments. So this paper was written in 1999. It kind of pains me to say this, but if you're my college student, you probably were not even born in 1999, right? So this is a paper that is older than you. Nonetheless, this paper was incredibly influential. I think it has over 10,000 citations, which is just so many citations. Very, very rare that an academic paper gets anywhere near that kind of citation. And I think it's for a lot of reasons. First of all, I think whenever we get to it, it explains something that a lot of us kind of have observed and felt. But also, if I had to teach a class on scientific writing or psychological writing, I would use this paper as an example of the pinnacle of scientific writing. It starts with some really funny, interesting observations and quotes. It ends with a bit of self-awareness and a joke. It comes up with really interesting experiments. They try to break their own experiments and think about how there might be other ways, so they make proper qualifications. It's just a really interesting study. Now, in the McRaney text, he cites some other studies where they expand or criticize this particular paper. paper. This paper has come under criticism. Some people argue that it's just sort of a statistical anomaly. And if you're not doing your statistics right, actually you can't replicate the results. Nonetheless, I do think that there's some really important stuff with respect to the ways that they set this up. And it does help us to think about some things with respect to critical thinking, and critical thinking, especially with respect to groups. So that's why we're going to cover it. But I think the paper is fascinating, and if you, I would recommend that you read it, and if not in its entirety, to read the first and the last section, because I think that they're just so interesting. But I'm gonna hit the highlights here. So Dunning and Kruger, they basically come up with this, and so this is the Dunning-Kruger thesis. Quote, we argue that when people are incompetent in the strategies they adopt to achieve success and satisfaction, they suffer a dual burden. And I put in brackets one to make it very clear. One, not only do they reach erroneous conclusions, but two, their incompetence robs them of the ability to realize it. The skills that engender competence in a particular domain are often the very same skills necessary to evaluate competence in that domain, one's own or anyone else's. So what the Dunning-Kruger thesis basically is that they noticed that in some domains of knowledge, not all domains of knowledge, and I'll give some qualifications here, in some domains of knowledge, it seems as though that the people who perform the worst, the incompetent people, are people who not only perform badly. That is a bad thing. You don't do that task well, okay? Especially relative to other people. But you don't even realize how badly you're doing that task. So the Dunning-Kruger effect is about people who do the worst very often don't even realize how badly they're doing. They think that they're doing much better than they actually are. So the Dunning-Kruger effect in common colloquial use is the idea that the least good at a particular task don't even realize how crappy they are at that task, okay? Now, they come up with 4 predictions in their study, and I'm not going to go too much into it, but basically it's the idea that first and foremost, incompetent people overestimate their skills. They think that they do way better than they actually do. They don't say like, oh, I don't know, like hard to say. They have a definitive answer, and I'll get into it whenever we see the graphs, but it overestimates what they can actually do. In addition, because these incompetent people don't really understand the task that well, they're not really able to not only gauge their incompetence, right? They overestimate how good that they do. They can't gauge anyone else's incompetence or competence. They don't have the skills to realize whether someone is talking in the same way, and I'll come back to this as well. Thirdly, in situations where the experimenters are allowed to see how they're doing with respect to other people, not to see whether they're right or wrong ultimately, but to see how other people are approaching a problem or how they're solving something, incompetent people, despite the fact that they overestimate what they do, they can't use the data from other people, what other people are doing, to become better. It's just not possible for them. And then lastly, and this leads to a little bit of a paradox that I think is a really interesting observation on their part. They don't think that incompetent people are doomed always to be incompetent. You can teach people. They can learn something about a skill, right? They can move from being a novice very early in the skill, very new to the skill, to being maybe something like an amateur, and you're developing skills to becoming maybe something like an expert. That's totally possible within a lot of these skills. However, this does a couple of things. Whenever you move from being a novice to being an amateur or intermediate or expert, you gain the skills to understand how good or bad you probably are, to understand how good or bad other people probably are, but you also lose that status of being incompetent. So it leads to a paradoxical or maybe a pretty obvious conclusion in a certain way. The way to cure the Dunning-Kruger effect is to educate people. But if you educate people, then they're no longer incompetent, right? So hopefully you see how that's a little paradoxical, and that's one of the things they did. So how did they test this? Because they're not just opining about these things. They're trying to test these things as empirically as possible. I'm gonna take a sip of my mint tea here. All right. Um, they came up with like three really interesting tests, and maybe you could take issue with them, but they take issue with them as well. I think they do a solid job of justifying why they use these particular tests. So the first test is humor, and what they did was they took basically some jokes from a joke book, and to establish how funny they were, they assembled a panel of comedians, and they had the comedians rank on a scale of how funny these jokes were. The comedians, except for one deviant comedian who was excluded because their answers didn't match most of the other comedians, that they basically agreed, which is kind of fascinating. They agreed that some jokes were good and some jokes were bad. Okay, so they used that as the baseline, and then they asked average people, undergraduates at their university, whether whether any specific joke was funny or not funny. And so they ran them through the same list of jokes. So, like, let's say that there's 10 jokes. They asked the comedians to rank each joke's funniness on a scale. Then they asked undergraduates to rate those same jokes on a scale. And what they found was basically this particular trend, and this trend will be pretty much same, and I'll point out what's going on. This is arranged in quartiles. So one quarter, one quarter, one quarter, one quarter, 25% of people split into a group of four. The bottom quartile thought that they would probably have about 60% of the answers correct, when in actuality, they only got 10% of the answers correct. Whereas the people in the top quartile, they estimated, yeah, I'll probably get about 70% of the answers correct. They actually got closer to 90. Okay. And so the humor test, they realized that humor can be a little subjective. So we'll keep it at that. They said, well, let's go a little bit more objective. The one in the middle was a logic test. And what they used was the law school admissions test, which has logic, sort of like these logic prompts. And there are definitive answers there just in the way that the questions are used. It'd be kind of like using the SAT or the ACT or something like that. And what they found, again, the bottom quartile estimated that they would 60-70% of the answers correct. They got 10% of the answers correct. Whereas the people who scored, again, around that 90% mark, they consistently were ranking themselves 70-60%. So pretty much followed the previous example, although there's a little bit of a dip with respect to perceived performance with this. They did the same thing with respect to grammar, and it followed the same trend. And grammar here, just in standard formal American grammar, of course, there are dialectical differences or whatever, but in establishing formal questions, again, they found the same pattern. So they came up with 3 different tests. They even had a 4th test where they were able to gauge themselves with respect to others. They found the same exact trend. And so what I want to point out here are a couple of things. I've circled here with the orange the biggest disparity. The biggest disparity between actual performance and my reported or perceived performance on a particular task is in the bottom quartile, aka the incompetent people. The incompetent people were basically overestimating their abilities by around 50%. So they would say that they would go over 50%, 60% on how well they would do. And they were pretty consistently 10-ish%, maybe a little bit above that. So the bottom quartile, the most incompetent people, drastically overestimated how well they thought they did. Okay. Now, I want to point out, and this is what I've tried to highlight with this yellow bar across all 3 graphs. It's no coincidence, I don't think, that they estimate their abilities at around 60%. So they ask them, how good do you think you're going to do, or how good did you do, depending on whether they're doing the surveying before or after the purported task. The people say, well, I think I probably did above average, probably about 60%. And so this is what some people call the above average effect. Dunning and Kruger reference this a little bit. The idea is that most people, even if they don't, you know, I don't think that it's the most hubristic. I don't think that it's the most in your face type of arrogance. They're just aiming to be better than middle of the pack. But not everyone can be better than average, right? Like that's statistically impossible. Not everyone can be better than average. That's the whole point of relative metrics and statistics. You can separate performances out. And yet, not many people will rank themselves as below average at certain tasks. There's something about our baseline, and maybe this is cultural. I don't know if there's any cross-cultural studies with respect to this, but a lot of people will say, yeah, slightly above average, uh, and that's not the case. There are a lot of people who score well under average, and that is the first two quartiles. The bottom and the second quartile pretty drastically underestimate how well they do. That's just kind of what happens. And so, just to remind you, with the two theses of this Dunning-Kruger are this: incompetence, one, causes poor performance. So the people in the bottom quartile don't do well. I think that's just pretty obvious. But secondly, there's something about incompetence, at least in certain tasks, that prevents people from understanding how badly they do. And it also prevents them from understanding how well or how badly other people do. Okay. So the third thing that I'll point out is with respect to the top quartile, the people who do the best. The other consistent finding was that they consistently underestimated their own performance. They underestimated their own performance. So incompetent people overestimate their performance. That's what the Dunning-Kruger is most famous for. But there's this secondary effect of the experts in the task underestimate their performance, and they overestimate what they think other people are probably doing. So they underestimate their own, and they overestimate what other people do. Now, Dunning and Kruger call this the burden of expertise, in the sense that whenever you're an expert in a field, you kind of understand your own limits to a certain extent, and you understand that there's a lot out there that makes this complicated. And because you know how complicated this gets, this is what maybe leads to excess humility here. And because you're so good at it, because you're so natural, and this is reading into the study, this is later conversations that happened with respect to this study, because you're so good at it, you tend to assume that other people are much better than they actually are. So part of being an expert means that you're really critical of yourself because you understand how all the limitations, but you also kind of overestimate what other people do. So the Dunning-Kruger effect, again, just to reiterate, the least competent people in certain tasks overestimate their own ability, okay? But the most competent people tend to underestimate their own ability. So, for our class, I really want to emphasize one of the things that they say toward the concluding parts of the paper, and it is this. Finally, in order for the incompetent to overestimate themselves, they must satisfy a minimum threshold of knowledge, theory, or experience that suggests to themselves that they can generate correct answers. So Dunning and Kruger, I think, are relatively careful scholars here. Certain people who have criticized them would disagree, but that's okay. What they notice is this would not reproduce in all things. Okay, so for example, there are experts who have a really high level of knowledge, but also realize that, that their skill level is probably really low. They bring up the example of coaches. So coaches might know how to play football, but they also know if they're 50, they're not competing with D1 athletes. They're not competing with pros. That's just not going to happen. Okay. So that can happen. But also, I think the effect is most pronounced in skills or in domains where this is the key phrase here: a minimal threshold of knowledge, theory, and experience suggest to themselves that they can generate correct answers. Okay. So if I were to set in front of myself, but in front of you, because you're my audience for this video, a super advanced physics problem about quantum field theory, talking about the spin of particles and asking you to calculate something. First of all, I wouldn't be able to read it. Unless you're like an advanced physics student, you probably wouldn't be able to read it. In that case, we would pretty accurately judge that we can't do that task. It's just way too complicated. We just can't. Like, what are you kidding me? Or if we were to go to the gym and we were to put 500 pounds on the barbell and say, do a bench press, we would refuse unless you just happen to be like a tank. You're a powerhouse, right? But 500 pounds on the bar for a bench press is a lot of weight. We're not going to try to do that. So there are tasks where it's really apparent that we lack the intellectual, the physical, whatever it is, skill to do that particular thing. So this Dunning-Kruger effect does not hold across all kinds of tasks or all domains of knowledge. Nonetheless, it does hold in some, and it seems to hold in some where it seems like we have some familiarity. We do know what's going on. So they've run these kinds of things with chess as well. Novices at chess tend to overestimate how good they are, how many games that they'll win, for example, in an open tournament or something like that. Now, chess is a weird one because rankings, ELO scores can kind of make this a little bit less mysterious. But the Dunning-Kruger effect generally holds with that. Math, there are math batteries where you can kind of reproduce the same thing. But for our class, logic, which was one of the cases of the original Dunning-Kruger effect, and speech, which grammar isn't so much. But it's one of these things where I think, especially in critical thinking, these are skills that a lot of people think that they have, or the more global or maybe controversial skill is just understanding how the world works. Most of us are fluent in at least one language, right? Or we would like to think so. I have a friend, he's another philosopher, shout out Noah, who says, I speak two languages, English and bad English. I think he's ripping that from an action movie. And I feel that. But a lot of us like to think that we can speak our native language or the language that we grew up in, that we were educated in. We think that we can speak it pretty well. A lot of us think that if we're presented with a problem, we can kind of think through it if we go slow or methodical enough. A lot of us like to think that we are at least a little bit world wise. We can kind of figure out what to do with respect to problems about what makes ourselves happy, what puts us in the right situation, what career we should do, what relationship we should pursue, how we should organize our communities. And yet, those things are actually really complicated. And sometimes some of us are not so good at language. We're not so good at logic. We're not so good at figuring out how we should organize our communities. And that's where I think the Dunning-Kruger effect is just one of those things that can be really, really relevant to consider. So Dunning and Kruger, they end their paper with basically this observation that, they've done this study and it leaves them in a very, very uncomfortable situation where if they're confident in their study, they're really, really hoping that the study isn't crappy because they saw overconfidence most pronounced in the bottom quartile. So it's is it the most funny joke? I don't know, but it's a bit of self-awareness, and it's exactly the kind of self-deprecating and academic humor that I sometimes like. And that's that's what's going on here. In logic, in speech, in understanding how the world works, it's a really strange thing whenever you just run into complete and total confidence. So I have friends who are writers. I myself am a writer. It's just part of being in the job. And one of the frustrating things is that a lot of people think that they write much better than they do. And people who think that they're good writers, and this is especially sometimes in academia, but I won't diss my colleagues necessarily, but even in the real world, they will mistake good writing for the fanciest words or the longest sentences with lots of commas or really academic, highfalutin sort of sound and language. And that's not what good writing is. Good writing is being able to communicate what you want to communicate in the way that you can. It's about, it's about either capturing the essence of something or conveying something. So in a work email where you just need to send a memo that makes sure that everyone is on the same page, that makes sure that you know how to get the task done, you want the vocabulary to be simple. You want the instructions to be clear. You want the task to be executable and measurable. You don't want fancy vocabulary. I have friends who are like this in law enforcement or in law, and they'll say a lot of people will just think about what they see on TV, where they think that a lawyer is doing a really good job if they're being dramatic and loud and confrontational, uh, or people whenever they're arrested by the cops will think that it's about being showy or pleading your innocence, or just assuming that everything is going to go your way if you're truly innocent, where the law is like, the whole point of the law is that there are clear distinctions, and basically you say as little as possible until you get your lawyer there. That seems to be the collective advice of a lot of my friends. And then whenever you're in court, the lawyer who is most effective is the lawyer who proves that the facts or the evidence basically relate to the law that's relevant in the particular case. It's not all about the dramatics. It's not all about the dramatics. And people who don't know that can't gauge that very well. Okay? I think that's fascinating. I think that's really fascinating. I think it's fascinating that we can very clearly understand when something is way too complex for us, but with those tasks that we have at least a little bit of familiarity with, sorry, that's where we stand the chance of really screwing things up. It's in that what some people will call being a dilettante maybe stage, where we know a little bit, but we only know enough basically to get ourselves in trouble. And maybe you've heard that phrase. I only know enough to get myself in trouble. Meaning, if I were less than a novice, I would know I need to call in a professional because I can't do this. But if you know a little bit, you can very easily overestimate how smart you are, how simple the issues are when actually they're not very. You just end up getting into a lot of problems. For anyone who has owned a house, I don't own a house, but I have friends who do. This is how they often describe do-it-yourself DIY projects with respect to home maintenance. You estimate that you can do something, and then you just figure out, oh man, this led to a lot of stuff. So some people will call houses, your first house, like a money pit. You just start to do stuff, you screw it up, it ends up costing way more money to fix your screw up, etc. That's the Dunning-Kruger effect. In that whenever we're incompetent, we tend to overestimate it because we don't understand how much we don't know. Whenever we're experts, we tend to underestimate how good we are because we see all of the limits, we see all of the holes. That's just kind of what's going on. And the social aspect, which I think is really important here, the incompetent people do not know how to gauge whether someone else is competent. The experts are the ones who are most able to make those decisions, and sometimes they'll disagree. Sometimes incompetent people will really prefer something, but the experts will be like, that doesn't make any sense. That doesn't make any sense. So that's why the Dunning-Kruger effect, and I'm sure, I hope, you're seeing how strange this idea is. That's what's kind of like made it influential. That's why it's cited literally over 10,000 times. That's why it's led to a bunch of response studies. It's only, 25 years old as a study, and yet it's something that's been incredibly influential. All right. Now I want to relate it a little bit to politics, because something about the Dunning-Kruger effect, we saw it in Aristotle, at least a little bit. We saw the tragedy of the commons. There are older roots for a lot of these observations. It's just that contemporary behavioral science is finding ways to experimentalize and potentially quantify the results with respect to this. Bertrand Russell has a very famous essay called The Triumph of Stupidity that's written basically in World War II Europe. And he's talking about the Nazis and what's going on over there, and how the Nazis are awful and they're using violence, and they are that basically barbarity is very often allied with a lack of intelligence. but he also has like a lot of interesting observations. And I'm going to end this presentation with a famous quote by Bertrand Russell here, which is this: the fundamental cause of the trouble is that in the modern world, the stupid are cocksure, while the intelligent are full of doubt. Even those of the intelligent who believe that they have a nostrum are too individualistic to combine with other intelligent men from whom they differ on minor points. Perhaps we shall have to realize that skepticism and intellectual individualism are luxuries which in our tragic age must be forgone. And if intelligence is to be effective, it will have to be combined with a moral fervor which it usually possessed in the past, but now usually lacks. So this is really interesting to me, and it's interesting to a lot of people, which is why it's a famous quote. But the first part, which is what most people will know if they know this passage, the fundamental cause of trouble in the modern world is that the stupid are cocksure, while the intelligent are full of doubt. That's basically Dunning-Kruger. Now, Dunning-Kruger aren't measuring for confidence. They make some connections to confidence in the latter part of the original article. But it seems to be that when you look in the world, the people who are most confident, the people who are saying, hold my beer, are exactly the same kinds of people who are not good at what they do. Now, there might be a few exceptions. Really, really excellent athletes, for example, sometimes know that they're the best because they've had a form where it's really easy to see that you're the best. I think some medical practitioners are kind of like this. Surgeons, maybe infamously so. They have statistics on successful outcomes for their patients, and they have an ego to kind of match whenever they're very successful, especially with complicated cases. Nonetheless, those exceptions aside, the exceptions generally prove the rule. What that means is we can find a couple of exceptions, but we can only find a couple. That basically impresses that the pattern generally holds, that the most confident people are stupid, in the words of Russell, or incompetent, in the words of Dunning-Kruger, while the intelligent, the experts, in the words of Dunning-Kruger, they underestimate their own ability, or in the words of Bertrand Russell, they're full of doubt. That seems really, really weird here. And it seems really harmful in the case of political crisis. Because in the case of political crisis, what Bertrand Russell is really worried about is that the intelligent people, yes, of course there are holes in the argument. Of course things are imperfect. Of course you can't get the perfect solution off the ground immediately. But he says it's probably not very good in a time of political crisis for the intelligent people to be so individualistic and not cooperate with people that they disagree with only on minor points. Not that hard to poke holes into arguments, at least in minor ways. What's really important is collectively to organize to end crisis. At least that's what Russell is saying with respect to World War II. And then the last thing, and I think this is his it's tough to figure out whether you're the expert in a relevant area, but this is what he's saying. One of the things that's really important is if you are a person of high moral character, if you are a person who is fighting for justice, you're really trying to alleviate suffering, you're really trying to organize against oppression, especially of vulnerable people. Not only should you be intellectually superior, but you should also be passionate about it. You should also organize. And I think that's a really fascinating observation. Bertrand Russell said it during World War II. World War II obviously is a really, really dark time in European history, which is Bertrand Russell is in the United Kingdom, but all over the world. And I think that can be said for any other political crises that you may or may not be thinking of in recent history or even right now, given that we're in an election year, a couple of months away from a highly contested election. So just to offer a summary, I don't have a summary slide, I apologize. What this has been about is biases in groups, how we think with respect to other people. The first thing that we talked about was the tragedy of the commons. The tragedy of the commons is the idea that if a group has access to some common resource and there's no regulation, people tend to exploit that resource. And even though short term that might benefit any given individual a little bit, maybe a lot, collectively it leads to disaster for the common resource and therefore for everyone. It's like overfishing waters, overgrazing fields, over cultivating crops in fields, polluting the air, whatever else, microplastics. All of these things are failures because individually, a lot of people made a lot of money, or few people made a just unfathomable amount of money, and a lot of us are suffering now as a result, right? That's a really big problem. That's the tragedy of the commons. Whenever individuals who might benefit a lot will doom that collective resource, and make it really bad. So this is very often an argument for regulation, because without regulation, we often run into the tragedy of the commons. And then the second major thing, other than the tragedy of commons, is this Dunning-Kruger effect. And the Dunning-Kruger effect is brought up in a social thing because it's about competence. And it's about not only how the individual person did with respect to the task. The least competent overestimate their abilities. The most competent underestimate their abilities. But it's also the idea that the least competent people don't even understand what competence is. They certainly can't judge it in their own case, which is why they dramatically overestimate their own competence. But they can't even use information from other people to figure out that they're wrong until they become more educated and move from being like a novice to an expert, right? Moving more along that way. All right. So the social implications of that I think are really big in this Bertrand Russell case. So the Dunning-Kruger effect is just like just a fascinating thing. Colloquially, again, it just means that incompetent people tend to overestimate their worth, overestimate their ability. Experts tend to underestimate their ability, and I think that's kind of the takeaway point with respect to that. So I want to thank you for your attention. Feel free to ask questions about this in the comments or in class, and I will see y'all next time.